Hi, welcome to another episode of Kiwi Builds. Today we're going to be restoring an old donkey saw. It's got a broken handle, it's got no electrics, and it's got a broken motor. We're going to be using a few different tools that I've never used before. We're going to be doing a bit of welding, so I'm teaching myself to weld. We're going to be using the lathe and the milling machine. So what could possibly go wrong? Let's get started. So I get the whole thing apart and start having a good look at the three-phase motor that's already on there, and I realise that it's just not going to really do the job. I do end up repairing it and getting working in three-phase mode, but then I find that it won't cut the metal in the donkey saw. I bodge something together to validate all that. So I figure it's just easier to buy a motor off eBay and attach that. So that's what I end up doing. There's a continuity issue here. I don't have any footage of the painting. I forgot to do this. That's why it suddenly appears painted. So I end up running a test with the larger motor on there. It's also got a bigger wheel, and that propels everything around at about 150 revolutions. Hopefully this is going to come off without too much trouble. So I end up buying a smaller pulley and replacing that on the larger motor, and then I retest. Okay, so we've got this one off. It's about 58, 73. And you'll see here that the tachometer wasn't working, and that's because the magnet was put around the wrong polarity. So I swap that around and then it starts to work okay. 20% slower. So that drop in speed worked out more or less where I expected. Let's go have a look now at how I create the handle. So I didn't have a handle, so I had to cheat a bit here. I bought a handle off eBay for someone who was breaking a donkey saw apart and took some rough measurements. I also had to get the donkey saw working to allow me to cut the central piece for the handle so everything would stick to it. And that's what you're seeing there, me cutting that piece of metal. Once I've got the piece of metal cut down, I decide to sketch out how the handle's all going to fit together, that central piece of metal being a key part. That was turned down on the lathe, but I don't have footage of that. What I'm trying to show here is that the dog clutch mechanism is a compound curve. Now I have got a milling machine, but I'm only going to be able to cut on one angle on that. So what ends up happening is I end up having to shape the rest of it with an angle grinder. To help me line it all up, I draw a couple of lines on the piece of metal and then put some tape on it, and that'll help me line it up on the milling machine just for doing the cuts. I'm just doing all this by eye to get the bulk of the metal off, and then I'll finish it off by shaping it with the angle grinder. So just a couple of footnotes at this point. This is the first time I've used a lathe, milling machine and welder so it's sort of fairly full on, so don't be surprised if the welding joints don't look perfect. I'm trying to teach myself how to weld. Just bending the handle here so it doesn't bang on the safety cover of the machine. So this is what I ended up making. I need to get this sorted out and this sorted out so that they release properly, because at the moment they're not. There's probably just a wee bit too much metal there and this is bent, so we'll fix that now. Let's have a look. So as the saw descends, this should release. Yep, that's it. So let's do it. Okay, let's come to bits because that's just temporary. So with the handle up, you can see that there's a slight gap here and this is spinning freely. So the idea is that when this moves down, this pushes out and then that should engage with the teeth there, but you can see it's still spinning freely. So in effect I need to make a bit of a spacer here so to get this to work. Right, so I've made the spacer. It just goes on like this. Let's put all this back together and attach the spring. So when I push the handle down, this is going to come out and should force it out. Right, and then it will lock on that wee nub down there. So now when I turn this, it should go round. So that's working. It's probably time for a test. Right, it's engaged. Okay. Oh, I know why. So to get this to release when I want, I need to take a small amount off here and possibly raise this a bit more. Right, let's have a go at test number 2. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, we have to engage it. Right, so having got this working and seeing it stop for the first time, I think it could be better to have a micro switch installed. So to control the main power to the donkey saw, I needed what's called a contactor, and that will turn on and off 240 volt to the main switch, and that's achieved through a 12 volt DC switch. So I needed a 12 volt DC transformer, run that through the micro switch, and it should all work. And what you're seeing here is me just testing how this contactor works and figuring it all out. let's go through the various components. So what do we know? We've got a 3-pin plug, we've got a contactor that will take 240 and allow it to be switched through a 12-volt DC switch. To power that, I am going to need to have a 12-volt DC transformer. I've got a micro switch, I've got a main on-off switch for the whole donkey saw, and I've also got a motor. So the first thing I need to do is take power into the contactor, and then I'm going to run that same power, that same 240, to the transformer. So now I've got both devices live. I need to take that output from the transformer, the 12-volt DC output, and run that through the micro switch. So that's fairly simple. That just goes straight back to the DC transformer in and out. And then I also need, once the switch is on, the micro switch is on, I know that I've got power going through the contactor, and that needs to run through the main on-off for the donkey saw. So that's how the switching works. It's pretty simple. So we've got all the bits working. Some of the stuff wasn't painted, so let's do a bit of last minute painting. Clean these up, put some etch primer on them, then I'll put a top coat on them, assemble it all, hopefully it'll look okay. So I've got the basic cutting mechanism all working, but there's slop and a whole lot of parts on this hacksaw. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting a couple of shims in and I weld them in place just to try and remove that slop. I realise when I'm looking at all of this that the bed is really worn. You can see the light going underneath that ruler there. So I look at all of this and I decide I'm going to put some weld onto here to try and fix that problem as well. Let's do a final cut test and see how this works. Hopefully the micro switch will turn the motor off and it will release and everything will be nice and smooth, not quite as jerky as it's been before. Right. Voila, that's come to a nice smooth stop. Motor's turned off, handle released. Okay, that's the end of another episode of Kiwi Builds. We'll be using this to cut the base for the log splitter and one or two other things over the coming year. Thanks for watching, and don't forget, like and subscribe. Thanks very much.
Okay, go.
Okay, so that's another...
another blooper. It's just appalling.